This is a short presentation on hierarchy and structure in the Catholic Church in hopes that we can make sense of some of the other titles that we often hear, cardinal, archbishop, monsignor, and what we might be thinking or how we might make sense of that as theologians thinking about Christianity. The first thing to get in mind is really that the Church understands itself as ordered by sacraments. I mean, every Christian, even a low church Christian, thinks that something like baptism is an important ritual in the life of the Church. And it's either on kind of the Catholic model, the means by which you enter the Church, and it's kind of causal in that sense, or it might be in a more evangelical model, the first moment when you declare that you belong to the Church. But even, accounting for differences in agency, whether it's God acting on you to baptize you, or whether it's you proclaiming that you are baptized to the rest of the world, you claiming God or God claiming you, regardless of the agency, the Church is ordered and structured at the foundational level by baptism. And then as we move along, the Church is ordered and structured by her ministers, and different denominations in Christianity have different ways of thinking of this. One of the most ancient is to think of the sacrament of holy orders, and to think of that as a sacrament in some sense parallel to and building upon baptism. Now, in the traditional model of understanding the Church this way, with the sacrament of holy orders, there's a little bit of a play going on here with the singular and the plural, because there's only one priesthood. There's only one bishop, one high priest, one order in that sense within the Church, even though there are three ranks or three grades or three ways of belonging to that order. So we'll call it holy orders, meaning the three: the bishop, the priest, and the deacon. But the theology is clear. Even though you may first be ordained as a deacon, even though you may then be ordained as a priest, and only then be ordained as a bishop, the actual order of understanding is bishop, priest, deacon. And this is what's in Scripture. Christ did not set the apostles apart and make them deacons first and priests later and then bishops. Christ made them apostles, and he laid hands on them and told them to forgive sins, and whose sins they forgive are forgiven. He breathed the Spirit upon them. I mean, there's the sense that each of the apostles is fully a priest of Christ in his own right. And they exercise that ministry together, but that each has his own fullness of priesthood, and each can do everything that the other can. Perhaps Peter is a unique case, but you get the idea. There's even references in Scripture about, do not say that this one baptized you or that one baptized you. You've been baptized through a legitimate minister and apostle in the Church, and you've been baptized into Christ. All right, so that historically becomes the bishop. And the bishop has a particular church or a diocese. I put those words in quotes because they're technical terms, particular church or diocese. So right now I'm in Dade City, Florida, attached to St. Leo, and we're in the Diocese of St. Petersburg. Our bishop is Gregory Parks, and he is the one priest. He is the one bishop for this whole region. And we are the fullness of church when gathered with the bishop. In other words, there is not a sacrament, there is not a ritual that we cannot perform sort of all on our own. We always have to do that in communion with everyone else. I'm not saying that we're, separatists or apart from them, but I'm saying, if Bishop Parks wants to ordain, if Bishop Parks wants to confirm, if Bishop Parks wants to baptize, he can exercise that ministry anywhere and everywhere. And so we are fullness of church. We have the Eucharist. We have marriage. We have ordination, right? We have all of the sacraments, forgiveness of sins, and anointing when we're sick. Now, most people know many more priests than they know bishops. I mean, there are 50 or more priests for every bishop in our part of the U.S. And, priests are the ones with whom we work, right? We go to Mass typically at a parish, or we know our local pastor. Priests are ordained by bishops to share in that ministry. And so they operate within a diocese and typically are assigned to a parish. They could be assigned elsewhere. Deacons, similarly. Deacons operate within a diocese, and typically they're assigned to a parish. In the scriptural order, we might think it's the apostles, the bishops first, then the deacons. We read about that in Acts of the Apostles. And later, we get the elders, the priests, as a kind of separate expression of this priesthood. But both the priest and the deacon serve with the bishop, and the bishop invites them to share in the priestly ministries. Now, again, these days we speak of like a single sacrament of holy orders, referring to the bishop, priest, and deacon. But there is an ancient language, which is still present in some contemporary documents, to think of like the order of virgins, the order of widows, the order of the married. And again, our reflection here is that the church is ordered by this ritual life. The church is ordered by these sacraments in which God is made present to us. The church is ordered by these different expressions of virtue. All right, so we got the particular church, and each particular church, each diocese is fully church, but can only be fully church in communion with other particular churches. And in that sense, we speak of the universal church. This is very parallel to our language about the Trinity. The Father, the Son, and the Spirit are distinct. They're each is his own person, and yet they could never exist apart from each other. They sort of exist only by being in communion with each other. Right? So we have a Trinitarian image of how we're thinking of the relationship between bishops and the relationship between particular churches. It's fullness, and it also somehow creates the Catholic fullness in communion. Well, what then is the structure outside of a diocese? For simple need, just human need, dioceses need to be organized together. And there's an ancient way of organizing dioceses. 4, 5, 6 bishops, live in an area. And, well, this is really an ancient civil organization too. 5, 6, 7 cities and a couple of towns and all the rural countryside in between. They have a mother city around them. The metropolis, that's the big city. And, you tend to put all of your extra resources in the large city, in the mother city. And if you live out in the countryside, you come into the city when you need certain things done. I mean, think about our hospitals and these things. The biggest and best hospitals with the most extensive resources are in the metropolis. Well, there's a similar sensibility about what's going on with dioceses. So a diocese that has the metropolis for the civil area will have a bishop who's called the metropolitan bishop. And that bishop will have a kind of presidential authority over the surrounding bishops, mostly because, you can assume the bishop of the metropolis has the right kinds of space to host meetings, right? If you want to go to a large meeting with 6 or 7 bishops, you need a place that's got a hotel, and you need meeting rooms and all these things. And, well, I mean, there's a reason that even today we have conferences at large cities. They have the resources. All right, so the group of dioceses put together is called an ecclesial province. And the bishop of the largest city, typically the metropolis, will be the senior bishop. And he can be called archbishop or metropolitan archbishop. He's not a bishop any more or less than any other bishop, but that status archbishop designates that he has this authority, this presidential responsibility to call the other bishops together. And therefore, from the ancient days in the church, back to the 4th century at least, a metropolitan has certain privileges to visit other bishops, to encourage them, and, if needed, to correct them or to help adjudicate certain kinds of cases. So the metropolitan has some juridical authority to help out the bishops in the area. Now, in the ancient model, we tend to go straight from metropolitan to patriarch, which is further down on the list. So you may be familiar with a structure that effectively goes diocese, groups of dioceses, and a metropolitan ecclesial province, and then metropolitans, ecclesial provinces together in a whole church or a patriarchal jurisdiction. In which case, you're thinking of the Patriarch of Alexandria, and he's bishop of the town of Alexandria, the diocese there, and he's metropolitan archbishop of the couple of dioceses surrounding Alexandria, but he's patriarchal archbishop of of that entire region of the world, a third or a fourth of the world, depending on how you're dividing up the ancient world. Since then, more recently, canon law makes provision for an ecclesial region, which would be purely administrative, and might say, hey, these 5 or 6 metropolitan ecclesial provinces, they ought to coordinate together. And you might think, well, in the United States, we speak of the Southeast as a distinct region from the Northeast. We do not have an ecclesial region like that, but you could see why you might want to name the Southeast, which would have 3 or 4 metropolitan ecclesial provinces, into a single ecclesial region and say, yeah, you guys should talk about how to organize administrative tasks in a way that makes sense given your seasons and your health issues and your travel. And that very well might be different from the way that a region in a different, region, physiographic province, the Northeast might make it. Now, that is not, in fact, the way we're organized in the United States, but you could see its utility there. What we use in the United States is the Conference of Bishops. And again, this is a purely administrative distinction, but it basically says, national boundaries exist for a reason. People understand themselves united by some sense of common culture, some common government, common currencies. There are all kinds of things which suggests that the bishops of a politically defined nation ought to have a conference and they ought to organize themselves. And so we often hear of the president of the Conference of Bishops and the vice presidents and, committees that they would have. The USCCB is of whom we speak these days in the U.S. That's different from the structure that like the Episcopalians use in the United States, where they might speak of a presiding archbishop. They're not quite a national conference, but they're thinking something more like a patriarch or a church which is sui juris. Right? So the ecclesial region, the Conference of Bishops, those are just administrative kind of overlays which group people together. And, there might be reason to sort of normalize salaries across a broad region so that priests aren't tempted to become, a priest somewhere else so they make more money or something like that. All right, a patriarch, this is an interesting title. It's changed its usage throughout the 2 millennia. Currently, there are patriarchs in the Roman Latin Catholic Church, but the title is much more honorific. It really is just a title in a sense. Whereas there are other patriarchates in Catholicism, the Eastern Catholic patriarchs, who govern a church on their own, sui juris, their own kind of law. And these patriarchs sort of are the final moment in the hierarchy to approve bishops, to make decisions about liturgy and language and prayer and translations. So we see that structure still in the contemporary church, so it's not familiar to many people who might have grown up Latin or Roman Catholic. If we look at the ancient church, the patriarchal structure makes a lot more sense, I think, and then understanding how the church has grown and society has grown, I think we see the need to add ecclesial regions and ecclesial conferences as we get different kinds of nations. Right, up to the patriarchal structure, virtually all ancient Christians will agree. The Orthodox of the various kinds have a patriarchal structure with metropolitans and bishops, and it's a very similar theology. There is a disagreement, and this is part of what separates Catholicism, Latin, Western and Eastern Greek Catholicism, from Greek Orthodoxy or Russian Orthodoxy or any other orthodoxy in the second millennium sense of the term. And that is that this structure of hierarchy, groups of bishops and dioceses together in a province with one bishop as the metropolitan over them, groups of ecclesial provinces together in a whole church under a patriarchate, and then all patriarchs together under the Pope, that this hierarchy ends in a single, a unity for Catholics, and for others, it does not. It ends at some kind of college of patriarchs. Let's take a quick look at a map. This one I pulled off of the Wikipedia page, speaking about, ecclesial provinces, metropolitan, archbishop. And you've got here color-coded, I believe there's 32 different ecclesial provinces. So you can see Florida is its own ecclesial province, and Miami is where our archbishop is located. But we look north of Florida and we see 4 states together in an ecclesial province. And then we look, at Georgia and Alabama. They're in their own province. And so we're talking about groups of dioceses together with a metropolitan archbishop who helps to adjudicate certain things in canon law. All of these together in the United States also have a conference where each and every bishop in the United States belongs to the Conference of Bishops, or at least each bishop that has genuine pastoral authority is in that conference. All right, if we take a look at the ancient map, here we've got a map of the Mediterranean. We're loosely looking at the Roman Empire in the kind of lighter brown versus the darker brown, or the Byzantine Empire has a similar extent. And I've got highlighted for you in red the 4 most ancient patriarchates. So at the bottom of the screen, we have Alexandria down there at the mouth of the Nile, the southeastern corner of the Mediterranean. Jerusalem is just a little bit to the east of there. And then we have Antioch to the north of there. And we flip on around to Rome on the Italian peninsula. Now, Jerusalem is an ancient patriarchate for the obvious reason. I mean, James is the bishop there and Jesus dies there. Jerusalem is the city of the covenant. It's the place where the temple dwells for Judaism. And so it's a very important city religiously. In terms of its politics, it's not as important as Alexandria and Antioch, who have major ports attached to them. They're sort of gateways to the south, gateways to the east. And then, of course, Rome is the ancient capital of the world as far as the times of the incarnation are understood. Everything's oriented towards Rome as the capital. Later in the 4th century, Constantinople, which is highlighted in a yellow bubble up there, Constantinople claims to be a patriarchate and carves out its territory and establishes it. So sometimes we speak of the 5 ancient patriarchs, or the pentarchy, and sometimes of the 4 ancient patriarchs, depending on what we make of Constantinople kind of adding itself in by ecumenical council in the 4th century. But you could see we would just split the map, and there would be a number of metropolitans who would look to Rome as their patriarch, a number of metropolitans who would look to Alexandria as their patriarch, a number who would look to Antioch. And perhaps that map helps make sense of how we might think of patriarchs. Now, we also have these titles cardinal and monsignor, and I sort of avoided them carefully to a certain extent, but also because you don't need cardinals or monsignors to explain the hierarchical structure, with the bishop who has the support of a metropolitan archbishop who has the support of a patriarchal archbishop. And we don't really need to talk about conferences of bishops or ecclesial regions. Well, what then is a cardinal? What's a monsignor? To a certain extent, these are really honorific titles that come with some functions. Cardinal has a clear function, and this is made prominent in the 2nd millennium, where a cardinal is one who elects the pope. And if you think about it, the process for electing a bishop is typically for the people in the diocese to gather. Either it's the clergy or the clergy and the people, and the election's overseen by the metropolitan. And so it's sort of a local affair in a certain sense. But that raises the question of who oversees the election of a metropolitan? Well, okay, so you develop some structure that maybe there's a next in line in succession, the most senior bishop or the oldest bishop, or maybe 3 of the bishops have to gather together in order to oversee such an election. You get this kind of give and take in that. You move on up the hierarchy on this sort of ordered structure, and you begin to wonder, well, how then should we elect the Bishop of Rome? Because as soon as we elect him bishop, he's going to be metropolitan archbishop, and he's going to be patriarchal archbishop, and he's going to be pope. So the system develops by which you appoint very senior and respectable and should be holy and virtuous men to be honorary clergy in Rome. And that way, when it's time to elect a new bishop of Rome, it's the clergy and the people of Rome who elect their bishop, but, you might normally be bishop in Chicago, and you're also made a cardinal, and so you have an honorary, church or an honorary post in Rome. Therefore, you're clergy in Rome, and you can elect the pope. That obviously expands to include advisor to the pope. The pope can call a meeting of the cardinals, generally called a consistory. He can establish new cardinals. This is all laid out in the Code of Canon Law. It describes a couple of different ways for these things to happen, but it's pretty tightly regulated, laid out rather specifically. And there are different, vestments that a cardinal can wear or insignia that a cardinal can have to show that he has this broad-reaching responsibility within the church. The title Monsignor is an honorific title, and it too arises from the sort of service to the Pope or service in Rome. So some of the Monsignors are thought of as like, a chamberlain to the Pope or a minister to the Pope. Others are thought to be in the diocese. So it's a title which is sometimes just given by the culture, like in Italian, Monsignore, a monsieur, a man, a nice guy, senior, right, an elder. But in its ecclesial use, it's an honorific title. And in some cultures, it's common just to call, like your bishop a monsignor to give him that honor. But in the Roman use, it would be something that like the bishop would ask for from the Pope, and the Pope would give to a particular priest. Typically, the number of kinds of Monsignor have ranged. There were 3 before Pope Francis suspended the use of it in order to kind of pull back on the clerics seeking different titles and to get them to focus on being priests in and among their people. Similarly, there are 3 sort of ranks of cardinal called a cardinal bishop, a cardinal priest, a cardinal deacon, and they have different functions. That has remained, largely because we need the curia and we need people to elect the Pope. But under the current Pope, Pope Francis, we're not making too many new monsignors, and so the honor is not bestowed upon as many people as it was in the past. But you would still meet someone with the title, and monsignors get slightly different house cassocks to wear and dress. They can have a little bit of extra color in their uniform, so to speak, to note that they're a revered and honored priest.